Hello, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have as my guest a longtime friend, Anders Åslund. Anyone who knows anything about economics knows that this is one of the premier economists in the world, and certainly the leading expert on all things Russian, Eastern European, Ukrainian, uh, and just the best person in the world to talk to about the future of Ukraine, the future of NATO, the future of whether we're going to have World War III. And we're going to have a very fascinating discussion about these and other topics. I just want to start out by saying lovely to see you, Anders, and we go back quite a ways. And I'm going to let you retell the story, but of how we met. And uh, uh, let me just give a general sense of your bio here. Uh, so Anders is a Swedish economist, got his PhD from Oxford. He's a former senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's also chairman of the International Advisory Council at the Center for Social and Economic Research. He's worked on economic transitions. He's worked as an economic advisor for Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Ukraine. He's worked as a director of the Russian and Eurasian program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's was a very much intimately involved in advising the Russian government when they moved from, when they became the Russian government as opposed to the Soviet Union about radical economic reforms. He worked with Jeff Sachs in this area and David Lipton. He's been described by David Frum, for example, a neoconservative, as one of the world's leading experts on the collapse of the planned Soviet economy. So he has this great, in-depth and on-the-spot knowledge of what happened in the past, but he's been working in the area ever since, and really for his entire career, either physically or remotely. But he was a professor of economics, international economics at the Stockholm School of Economics in his earlier days, became the founding director of the Stockholm Institute of East European Economics. And he's a prolific writer. He has something like 30 books here. I kind of trouble. They're listed on Wikipedia. I'm not sure whether we've got to all the books. The last one that's listed here is 2019, but they have titles like The Russian Balance Sheet, How Ukraine Became a Market Economy and Democracy, Russia's Crony Capitalism, The Path from Market to Kleptocracy, Putin's Economic Policy and Its Consequences, Ukraine, What Went Wrong and How to Fix It. And it just, one book after the next, the origins of Ukraine's democratic breakthrough, that's called The Revolution in Orange. So we're really here with the world's expert on, again, Ukraine, Russia, Eastern Europe, and geopolitics, not just in that part of the world, but more generally. Anders has been an outspoken critic of what's going on in our country with President Trump's policies. So welcome, Anders. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much, Larry, and you are all too kind, but of course I greatly appreciate it.
Well, I don't think I am. I think everybody who knows you, every economist that has interacted with you thinks the same, and for good reason. You know your stuff and you do your homework. And but let's talk about how we met. if I recall, it was somewhere around 1998 or so.
Yeah, I think it was 96, but we published a book with an article of yours that you came to Moscow and presented at the Carnegie Moscow Center where I worked then. And it was a great piece, and I took you to then former Prime Minister Gaidar, and you touched off with him very well and worked after that for many years on projects at the Gaidar Institute in Moscow when it was still a very decent reformist place. You were quite fascinated by seeing Moscow at the time, so I took you around, and since then we have kept in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. So Anders brought me to Russia to help to deliver this paper, and also to meet with members of the Russian government to discuss. We were focused, substantially on Russian pension reform at the time, and then I came back on one or two occasions. I met Gaidar, who was the first prime minister under Yeltsin, fantastic person, and after he left the government, he set up the Gaidar Institute, which is their think tank, which was a liberal think tank at the time. I don't know how it is doing today, but I was asked by the folks at Gaidar in around 2013, 2012 to come and work periodically to be an advisor on their research efforts in the area of macro and public finance. So most people don't know that I spent 6-7 years prior to COVID, spending a week in the spring and a week in the summer or the fall, 2 weeks a year physically in Moscow, and then my Russian colleagues from Gaidar would come and spend a couple weeks in the U.S. So this was a very intense relationship, and we worked on long-term fiscal sustainability in Russia and on building a global climate model that just got published in the European Economic Review. So this was a lot of fun, and it was so I working just a few blocks from the Kremlin and meeting a number of members of the Russian government, but not obviously not people like Putin not at that level, but so I have some sense of how things operate there. Tell us what you think, Anders. Let's get right to the point, which is how bad is the situation how bad are the prospects for Ukraine at this point, given what your understanding is of what U.S. policy will be with respect to Ukraine once this proposed peace agreement that Trump is trying to produce, maybe it's real for real in his head, maybe it's just a kind of an excuse to pull out of NATO. But give us your take on the situation. What are Ukraine's prospects? What are their prospects for NATO? What are the prospects for World War III in Europe? Take it away.
That's a lot of questions.
And take your time, because people.
Yeah, but let me go back.
Not for me, okay?
You should also mention that the reason why the Russians were so interested in you was that they did undertake a pension reform, very much partially on your lines with private pension accounts. Now, basically, they have destroyed it, but they did it in the good reformist years that were particularly in the early 2000s. And now I'm afraid that all our friends there are either, well, most of them have emigrated to various places, Berlin or the Baltics. I was recently at a Russia Studies conference here at George Washington University, and I was struck by a couple of things. Russian studies have now been taken over by Russians. And these are Russians about 40 years of age with good Western education. And previously they tended to be in the US. Now they are in Europe. Berlin, Paris, Helsinki, Stockholm, Oslo. So Europe has taken over this place, which it did not have at all before, that the US was much stronger in Russian studies. Now the US is pretty weak. It is people in the 70s or more who carried it out, and many of the great names have already passed away. But our friends, Gaidar died in 2009 from a heart attack, and felt very much left out. Some people have ended up in prison, but most have got the opportunity to flee. For example, my close friend Leonid Gozman got out by accident and managed to flee to Berlin. And former Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov lives in Riga now. My favorite when it comes to current economic discussion, Vladimir Milov, former Minister of Energy, sits in Vilnius. So the good people who still speak are abroad. And some of our friends who actually dealt with your question, like Mikhail Dmitriev and Tatiana Maleva, they are still in Moscow, keep a very low profile. You would say that they are internal exile, absolutely not doing anything political. So the Russian intellectual stage, which was vibrant in the early 2000s, is now not only stale, but quite terrible. Over to Trump's policy on Russia and Ukraine.
Well, we just paused to mention Boris Nemtsov, right?
Yeah.
And Boris was a brilliant person. I met him, spent an afternoon with him, and of course he was murdered several years ago, and probably the lead.
2015, outside of the Kremlin, obviously on the order of one of the top people in the Kremlin.
Yeah, and probably the leading critic and one of the bravest people that I've ever met. Clearly.
Yeah, I kept in touch with him, seeing a couple of times a year, and he was, since he had been first deputy prime minister, he was felt pretty sure. He thought that he was afraid that they would put him in prison, but he didn't think that they would kill him. And this was a blatant KGB murder just outside of the Kremlin. So that was really ugly. And I mean, the other big reform person, the only one who remains alive, Anatoly Chubais, is fled Russia 1 month after the war started in 2022, and sits now in Tel Aviv as the former head of the Academy of National Economy, to which the Gaidar Institute was part of, Vladimir Mao. So people have fled in all directions where they could, and to stay in Russia is dangerous. About 50 senior executives have fallen out of windows and died. So it's a huge number. Yeah.
50 executives.
Yeah.
My God.
And for example, 3 top executives in the Lukoil, which then is understood as somebody is trying to take over the Lukoil.
Lukoil. This is the second largest oil energy company in Russia. It was private. Yeah. Now you're saying it's basically being
it's still private, but it's it is in a very circumscribed situation. But over to Trump's policy here. I think that the best way to understand Trump when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, is to see him as a junior partner to Putin. A junior in the sense that he has no policy input and he does what Putin likes. So we just ask, does Putin like Ukraine? No. Okay, we beat Ukraine as much as the US electorate allows us to, and apparently that's quite a bit. Does Putin like USAID? No, we close it. Does he like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America? No, we close it. Does he like democracy endeavors abroad? No, we close it. And in this way, Trump's behavior seems quite predictable and understandable. Does Putin like that we call him an aggressor in the UN? No. Then we vote with Russia, North Korea, Belarus, and a handful of other countries, mainly military dictatorships in Africa, while even China and Iran abstained on the vote, and more than 100 Western and developing countries voted for the condemnation of Russia. There were two such votes in the UN General Assembly since Trump had come in. And the strange thing is that this is not a discussion. People don't know that the US now votes with Russia on such controversial votes. And as the policy is made, it's essentially only two people who matter. That's Trump and Witkoff. Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, is completely sidelined. And Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, is here commonly called dead man walking, after half a dozen of his top aides have been sacked by this conspiracy theorist, Laura Loomer, who got to Trump, and Trump immediately sacks these people, fires these people without asking Waltz about it. If you lose so many people, then you can't do very much. And Witkoff, when he now met in the Kremlin, Putin and two of his top aides, he comes alone with an interpreter that was possibly provided by the Kremlin. And he sits there and negotiates with Putin, that is essentially receives instructions from Putin. So the best that can happen with Trump's work, purported work on ceasefire in Ukraine, is that he declares victory and goes home, because it has no sensible ground.
Let's talk about retirement for a minute. It's something Americans think about regularly. Ask yourself, how financially secure do you really feel? Do you have enough money to retire? How much is really enough? And if you don't have enough money, how can you possibly find that extra money before you do retire? These are all tough questions. My retirement software, Maxify Planner, is the powerful online planning tool that takes the guesswork out of retirement. It weighs your assets against your fixed expenses to calculate how much you can safely spend every year for the rest of your life based on when you decide to retire. And it shows you safe ways to find more money. Maxify makes a complicated problem like retirement planning simple. It's accurate, easy to use, and produces what you really seek, peace of mind. So make the smart choice and visit Maxify.com today. Don't miss this opportunity. That's Maxify with an I, M-A-X-I-F-I, Maxify.com. Now let's get back to the podcast. Let me just ask you, I mean, you're describing President Trump as an agent of Russia, or as basically as a traitor, American traitor. Do you have any, when you say, he's being taking directions, he's a junior partner, Why is that? Do you think this is, I mean, do you have any sense of where this is coming from? Do you think the Russians have something compromise over Trump that to the point where he's an asset and agent? Do you think I mean, I didn't say that you called him an agent or an asset, but you're kind of describing him. You're describing somebody who is could potentially be that. Let's put it that way. Uh, so, where do you think this is coming from? Do you think this is just admiration? Uh, and why? There's lots of dictators to admire. Why admire this one?
Yeah, Craig Unger has
I
written
mean,
two
I'm not
good.
saying anybody should admire any dictator, but I mean, there's a lot. Go ahead.
Craig Unger has written two good books: The House of Putin, The House of Putin, and the House and American Compromat. I think it's the name of the book, and he goes through all these Russian contacts that Trump has had. So let me just list which the points are. Trump went to the Soviet Union, to Moscow in 1987, and the former head of Kazakh KGB has claimed that he learned while working KGB in Moscow that Trump was recruited as an asset, not agent, but asset, in 1987 under the code name Krasnov. And this is a senior KGB officer who claims this. And Unger has a lot of observations how strange Trump's visit to Moscow was at that time. Then Trump's business has essentially been to sell condos, no questions asked, in New York and Miami. And perhaps 1/3 of these clients have been from the former Soviet Union, primarily from Russia. So Russia has been his main source of income. More specifically, in 2008, Trump sold his building in Palm Beach, Maison d'Amitié, that he had bought for about $50 million to a Russian oligarch, Dmitry Rybolovlev, who for a bit more than $100 million. And this was when Trump was in a tight situation. So he made more than $50 million on one house in Palm Beach, which made no sense. This looked like a gift to Trump. And then, of course, Trump was greatly helped in 2016 by Russia. And there are a couple of prominent Russian oligarchs who are big in New York real estate that have figured in the Manafort story and have played a big role for Giuliani. So there are lots and lots of connections, and they're well known and well documented. But at the bottom of it is what you just suggested. Trump simply likes. People are autocratic and kleptocratic. And this is exactly what he wants. We can see that he has now a dozen people in his in top position in his administration who are billionaires, because Trump likes billionaires and he couldn't care less about the rule of law. So, but there are also, who else does Trump like? Modi in India, of course, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, and the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi as well. So these are the kind, Trump has even called President al-Sisi of Egypt his favorite dictator. So this is the world that Trump lives in, and what he likes. So Putin fits right in there, and he can't stand Democrats. But over to Europe, I think that Europe got two big shocks in February. The first was 14th of February, when J.D. Vance made his infamous speech at the Munich Security Conference, accusing Europe of not being free and democratic, essentially making all the accusations that should be made to the Trump administration. And then far worse, the ambush by Trump and Vance of President Zelensky in the White House on the 28th of February. And after that, Trump cut all deliveries of intelligence and arms to Ukraine for 11 days. This was a real shock to Europe, because Europe saw that the US is not reliable. Essentially, you can say that NATO died on the 28th of February, in the sense that it's no longer credible as a security guarantee. It's still an organization. Organizations often survive much longer than their credibility. And the Europeans are not talking about leaving NATO because they need it as an organization for all kinds of military purposes. But the Trump administration is now discussing that SACEUR, the supreme commander in Europe, should no longer be an American. And we should expect that the US withdraws in substantial ways in Europe. And in particular, Poland and the Nordic and Baltic countries are now rushing to increase military expenditures as fast as possible, up to 5% of GDP. Because the Estonian military intelligence, that I think is the best. I was there last in September and will go there again now in May. They think that there will be a war in 3 to 5 years if Russia wins in Ukraine. So it's vital for Europe that Ukraine doesn't lose, and that Europe can give as much aid as possible. So essentially, the US is out. And of course, USAID played a big role to support Ukraine, because the Biden administration, by and large, used Samantha Power and USAID to provide assistance, civilian assistance to Ukraine. And now it's up to Europe, and Europe has substantial holds. What they talk about militarily is logistics. Europe hardly has any big military transport planes, which is a strange but quite important shortfall. Another, intelligence, and a third, air defense. The Patriot rockets are very important for defense. But what is happening now is that Ukraine has developed an extraordinary armament industry with more than 500 startups. The best and brightest in Ukraine are now producing drones. Last year, they produced 1.5 million drones for military purposes. This year, it will be 4 million. And there are a lot of foreign companies who are involved in this. And this is increasingly being financed by European countries. And Denmark, for example, has sent all their howitzers to Ukraine and said, you need it more than we do. And they have also started producing howitzers together with Ukraine. And this so-called now Danish model is considered very successful. And the Europeans are doing as much as possible, but what they really should do is to take the $200 billion of Russian central bank reserves that have been frozen in the private Euroclear bank in Brussels. and this should be given to Ukraine. Then the financial problem for Ukraine is solved for some time, and Ukraine could use that money to win the war, buying arms in Europe.
Want more money, less risk, and a better life? Buy Money Magic, a new book by Lawrence Kotlikoff, Boston University economist, personal finance expert, and best-selling author. Whether it's education, career, marriage, housing, investing, retirement, Social Security, IRA, or 401k decisions, Money Magic delivers scores of secrets to raise your living standard. Financial journalist Jane Bryant Quinn says Money Magic is a must-read. Nobel laureate George Akerlof says Money Magic is quite probably the best financial advice book ever written. Financial guru John Malden says, you'll love this amazing book. It's full of wit, wisdom, and startling paths to a better financial life. And columnist Scott Burns calls Money Magic a funny, brilliant read, offering wildly powerful, unconventional choices that can literally change your life. Get Lawrence Kotlikoff's Money Magic today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and independent booksellers.
Let me ask you on that question. I mean, you're in effect forecasting that within, my understanding is that no additional armaments beyond what was basically provided for by Biden have arrived or have been authorized for Ukraine. So your forecasting, your prognosis is that within a couple months that these peace talks will fall apart, and that Trump will just say we're out of here and not send the Patriot missiles, not send any equipment, any ammunition, any armaments to cut off intelligence sharing, produce the same 10-day shock that you just described. Can Ukraine survive in the short run, without U.S. help?
Yes, but it costs lives. There are more people who will be killed, but this has increasingly become a drone war. And the Ukrainians are superior on drones to the Russians. But it's also become electronic warfare. So the Russians are better than the Ukrainians on electronic warfare, taking down the drones. So the Ukrainians are now increasingly producing drones that don't use the GPS, because GPS you can divert with electronic warfare. And in this way, the war develops quite fast. So say in the beginning, both sides dug down in trenches and it looked like World War I, 150 meters away from one another, and shooting from time to time. But now they have moved away because anybody in a trench can be killed with a drone. So they are now 15 kilometers away from each other and watching one another and killing one another with drones. So I heard in Pokrovsk recently, on the front in Donetsk Oblast, that 60 to 80 Ukrainian drone operators held 5,000 Russian soldiers at bay. They're taking out one after the other. And Russia still uses this meat grinder, but the losses are enormous. I presume that the right numbers are 200,000 Russian soldiers killed and 600,000 injured, while on the Ukrainian side, probably 80,000 soldiers killed and a couple of hundreds of thousands injured. Of course, neither side provides official information, and what has been confirmed is just a fraction of what has been the real thing.
Is there any prospect in the short term for the Ukrainians to develop their own or other European countries to develop their own anti-missile systems that could, if not perfectly substitute for the Patriot, be a close substitute. Let me or put it another way, if Ukraine had access to the $200 billion of Russian the assets that have been seized, would they be able to secure any type of replacements for the Patriot on the market? Is there anything out there that they could conceivably buy that could help?
I'm of course no technical specialist, but there are things. But the Patriots are considered very, very helpful. So President Zelensky asked President Trump if they could buy the Patriot missiles for $50 billion, and Trump said no. So this was not with US money, but that Ukraine would use then European financing for it. And
when was this conversation?
Don't remember exactly, but it was within the last month.
So okay, so that's a pretty strong statement. He's heading out the door, and so let's just suppose, let's look at the downside or the worst case scenario here, or let's look at a different scenario where maybe Ukraine can hold off Russia, and then meanwhile they open up a second front in Estonia. They just invade Estonia. What happens next?
Well, hardly anybody thinks that will happen. So it's that it would rather what the Estonians say in 3 to 5 years, because the Russians are not prepared to do it. But there are also observations that the Russians are not producing 300 tanks a year, which is not much. But they're holding them back and not using them in Ukraine. They are sending old refurbished tanks to Ukraine. And to a considerable extent, we are now using T-55s. That is from model from 1955. Previously, it has been T-72. And they had a limited number of T-90. The numbers stand for the year when they were developed. So this is very old equipment. So what Russia does now, what is serious is Iskander ballistic missiles, and which can also be used for nuclear arms. So they are using their air defense rockets for attacks on civilian buildings, S-300. And they are using these Iranian Shahed drones for bombing Ukraine. But what Ukraine is increasingly doing is that they also have ballistic missiles. They have far more drones, so that they are taking out one oil refinery and oil depot after the other on the Russian side, and of course also arms depots. And unfortunately, the Biden administration held them back. So one thing that Ukrainian military specialists say, we could have bombed a few bridges in Siberia, railroad bridges, and then the North Koreans could not have come through. And similarly, many of the tanks were there. And you know, these Siberian rivers are enormous. If you take out one of the railroad bridges there, it's not just to put a pontoon bridge in its place. It's serious damage for a long time. And
how do you reach that those bridges? That has to be special forces, right?
Yes, Ukraine has very good special forces, and they do operate in behind the Urals. So we are seeing that there are bombings that are taking place there.
So if you're Putin, you've got this great ally in Trump, as you're describing, let's presume. Certainly all the evidence points that direction. And now you know you're not going to be facing Patriot missile defenses. You think you can win. This is why he's keeping up the war. I mean, he could just declare a ceasefire and the other side would accept the ceasefire. And then we have, in effect, North and South Korea through the end of day, and now he's expanded Russia. Why not do that and declare victory? Because what you're suggesting is that he's playing a risky game where he might lose the war, even just notwithstanding U.S. pullout.
Well, I think that for Putin, it's better with a bad war than with a good peace. Putin needs the war itself. Putin has done wars all the time. 99 in Chechnya, then 2004 against the oligarchs, admittedly only through arrest. And 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Crimea, 2015 in Syria, and then 2022 in Ukraine. So Putin uses war. First, it increases his popularity at home, and it gives his regime a purpose. He's not doing anything for the Russian people. So then he needs to show, I'm gathering the Russian lands, as the phrase from Ivan the Terrible runs. And it gives him the opportunity to repress the Russian population more. So this suits Putin. If he would now go for a ceasefire, well, it would prove that he has sacrificed 800,000 Russian soldiers for 19% of Ukraine's territory, and essentially not captured any new big towns since 2014. So this would not look very impressive. And Russia has now, say, 2 million war veterans. And that was a big problem in the 1980s and the 90s with Afghan war veterans. And here it's very many more. And these are hardcore men who have PTSD, but no treatment for it. So this is not the kind of group you want to have home. So as it looks now, Ukraine probably has 900,000 men and women on the ground. Ukraine has many female soldiers, and Russia has 650,000 soldiers in Ukraine. So these are big numbers. But there are fewer Russians there than Ukrainians. So I don't think much of this that Ukraine has a shortage of soldiers. It's rather that we have a shortage of commanders and well-trained commanders. But Russia has the same problems, that they have sent probably 160,000 prisoners from Russian jails to fight in Ukraine. And many of these people have died, but this is quite gruesome.
I'd like to talk to you about a really powerful financial planning tool to help you make smart retirement and other critical financial decisions. It's a tool that factors in all your financial data and shows you what you can sustainably spend every year for the rest of your life. That tool is my software company's Maxify Planner. It's incredibly powerful, it's accurate, and it's easy to use. Maxify takes the guesswork out of financial decisions at every stage of life. Its focus is on raising, de-risking, and sustaining your living standard. Maxify lets you run what-if scenarios to see how your finances will change in taking new jobs, buying a home, doing Roth conversions, retiring early, downsizing, investing more in the market, you name it. Knowing the impact of these decisions before you make them is the secret to making smarter decisions. And it's also the secret to what we all seek, which is financial peace of mind. So please visit Maxify.com today to start planning. That's Maxify with an I, Maxify.com, Maxify.com. Now let's get back to the podcast. Okay, and I mean, Zelensky's been pretty, let's say, patient and continues. I mean, if he, and so have the Europeans, at what point are they going to say, U.S. go home, Americans go home? We're not encouraging any, no tourists should go to the U.S. The U.S., we're going to put sanctions on the U.S. for siding with Russia. And we have a complete separation, breakdown between Europe and the U.S., and perhaps a realignment between Europe and China. This, in effect, Trump may be an asset of Russia, but he surely cannot be a very smart one, or the instructions he then might be getting, if that's actually the case, from Russia can't be particularly good, because he's doing things that unless he really feels sure that he has complete control of power and can stop future elections, he's going to produce a recession. The probability that some people are forecasting, very well-known economists forecasting like a 90% probability of recession. We've seen just today there was a report that GDP has started to shrink in the first quarter. It grew 2.6% in the last quarter. In 2024, it fell about 0.3% this quarter, and that's before all these firings and deportations. If you deport 4% of the workforce, which is their goal, and you get rid of 20% of the federal workforce, which is their goal, and you disrupt all the trade, which is the reality of what's going on, and you embargo China, you produce you're going to start producing. You're either making, you're reducing, that can't, 4% of the workforce being shipped out is enough to produce maybe a 1% decline in GDP if it's on its own, or 2% depending on, or even higher depending on the productivity of those people being deported. But they are certainly, in the area that I live in, Providence, we have probably lots of illegal immigrants working in construction and no one else to replace them. So, we'll have a critical shortage in the ability of construction companies to operate anywhere throughout the country. So they'll start laying off their people. That's going to impact house price inflation. The whole story here. I
completely agree. I mean, I think that we will see a substantial decline in GDP this year.
But do you see realignment? Do you see this, or do you see three?
Let me take this. That I saw quite a few Europeans now in connection with the IMF and World Bank spring meetings here in Washington last week. And the general European attitude is, we sit back. If the Americans want to cause a completely unnecessary recession for themselves, there's nothing we can do about it. We're not going to comment on it. And at the same time, they don't want to talk to the Trump administration. There are very few people to talk to, because what has happened now in the administration is that it's about 250 people who have been appointed, and only 50 people have been confirmed by the Senate. So it's empty in the offices since Dodge has been there and sacked a lot of people. And now the administration doesn't function. So I asked about some decisions where they hadn't been made, and they said only decisions that are initiated at the highest level are actually being carried out. Otherwise, it's a paralysis in the administration, and there are too few people who are left there, so that they can't carry out any significant job. People are scared, dead scared. They don't protest, they are just scared. And this means that the US federal administration doesn't work now. It's not only chaos and uncertainty, but it's also a paralysis. And the Europeans don't want to be part of this. These various so-called trade negotiations that have been carried out, for example, with the Japanese and with the EU trade commissioner, the conversation goes like this. From the American side, what can you offer us? And the other side then asks, what do you want? It's you who should come up with an offer. You have ripped us off all these years, so you had better do something for compensation. So the conversations are extremely rude and unpleasant and insubstantial. So
you've heard of no trade deals that have been struck, even though Trump is saying there's these trade agreements in the works. You haven't heard of those?
No. So I heard Scott Bessent speaking at JP Morgan, and he was the most substantial, but I heard those who had conversations with Howard Lutnick, that is just rude and has nothing to say. So people don't see, why should we talk to Lutnick? And he's supposed to be the second most important after Bessent. And this Jamieson Greer, who's supposed to be US trade representative, seems to play no role whatsoever. And I heard that when the Japanese had some negotiations or conversations, then Trump came in and started talking, accusing them of something completely incomprehensible. As Financial Times wrote the other day, that Trump complains about the Japanese throwing bowling balls on cars. And you probably know that a Cybertruck is not allowed in Europe or anywhere outside of the US because it's too hard. So a normal car should have make a dent if it is hit, and that Trump thinks is wrong. So he goes, and therefore he wanted to block any agreement with the Japanese, according to Financial Times. So
you mean a Tesla truck? I mean, what do you mean?
Yeah, Tesla Cybertruck is not allowed in Europe because it is hard steel. So if you get hit by a Cybertruck, you definitely get killed. And so it's not allowed for road safety regulations in Europe. I'm sure it's the same in Japan. And Trump is angry about this. And he goes into small details like this with shower heads. That he starts fighting about it, and then he doesn't know the big things, that the US is the great beneficiary of the global financial market. So what I think will happen, I look up on the financial situation here as 1929, that the US has never had such high inequality as now. And the last time it had it was 1929. And Bradford DeLong, who also contributed an article to this book that we edited with you in Moscow, he wrote that from 1930 to 1980, there were essentially no new billionaires minted in the US with a value of the dollar in around 2000. And the reason were the first antitrust deregulation, and second, very high taxes. That the maximum marginal income tax was up to 91% until 1962. It was Kennedy that reduced it to 70%, and then Reagan brought it down to 28%. So it's from the 1980s with Reagan's deregulation and with much lower taxes that we have seen all the billionaires coming to the fore. So what I would expect is that we will see a massive financial crash, and I saw it in Sweden around 1990, and in Russia in 98.
You're telling everybody to get the hell out of the stock market immediately.
Yeah, indeed. So what
You
happened?
think the U.S. is going to default on its debt? Is that in your prognosis?
I mean, it's a straightforward in that direction, but normally countries stop before they reach a default. But what happened in 91, 98, 91 in Sweden and 98 in Russia, it is you balance the budget. So when you have to cut public expenditure, the US has not much to cut, and you have to increase taxes. And what happened in the 1930s, it was that the very wealthy had to pay much more taxes, and that continued during World War II. So, and there was much more regulation, and there was more social welfare. So I think that we are seeing that the billionaires are likely to suffer the most, and we can see now that what companies have lost the most. Well, the Magnificent Seven as a group have lost more than 20% of the stock value, of course, depending a bit on which day you take. And they are extremely dependent on global supply chains and of sales. So I think that these will be the big ones. Now at this JP Morgan conference, there were 4 things that they recommended to buy: gold, cash, trash, and utilities. Trash and utility equity have the advantage that they are strictly local. There's no foreign input or output involved in them. So it's really a very pessimistic mode. And of course, this is aggravated by the undermining of the rule of law right now in the US.
Wow. Quite the takeaway here. We've got the end of NATO, the survival of Ukraine, although with lots more deaths in Ukraine at a very high price, U.S. withdrawal from Europe militarily, the Great Depression around the corner, yet again, the complete collapse of the stock market. The stock market dropped in nominal terms about 86% between 29 and 33, probably less in real terms because of deflation. To basically leave the market immediately and get to safety. And I mean, one of the assets that is available right now are inflation index bonds. The 30-year tip is yielding 2.6%. Would you hold those in your own portfolio?
No.
No? You're that concerned?
It was quite interesting that JP Morgan did not recommend treasuries. They look upon treasuries as risky. And if we take the numbers, Larry, the US needs to refinance $9 trillion of US treasuries this year. The total is 29 trillion treasuries outstanding. So it's almost 1/3 that needs to be refinanced. And then of this $2 trillion in new debt, 6.5% of GDP. And foreigners hold $8.5 trillion of US treasuries. Why would they buy more when Stephen Myron talks about converting them to something that they didn't want? So
Stephen Myron is, he's actually my former student at Boston University, now chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and he's suggested in a paper that the U.S. might, in effect, tax the return on foreign investment in U.S. treasuries so that the foreigners could pay for U.S. defense security arrangements. And of course, those security arrangements are worth nothing, as we've been hearing, those security promises. So, but you're saying okay, so you're expecting interest rates to go sky high, for much further, bonds to fall in price. But inflation index bonds, if you buy them and hold them, obviously 30 years long period, there's also shorter term. Short of default, you're going to be locking in your real return path. I think that's maybe something that JP Morgan or whatever, it was a JP Morgan conference, maybe these guys were not that familiar with exactly how, the buy and hold strategy, as opposed to what's going to happen to my market portfolio tomorrow. Obviously a 30-year tip if could drop in value to get today, but the price drops, the yield goes up, and the product stays the same, and you're getting the same stream of real income. So,
but the question remains: are the U.S. treasuries safe? I mean, the foreigners, the public or private, had better not buy more U.S. treasuries. They're not safe, and the dollar has fallen 10% in relation to the euro already since Trump came in. And I saw Goldman Sachs chief economist Jan Hatzius arguing that it has much more to fall. And if we take the stocks, the US had a price per earnings of 25 before Trump came in, while Europe and the UK had 15, which is sort of normal. So there has been an overvalue in the US stock market because it was so highly considered under the wonderful President Biden. And now comes a man who couldn't care less about it. And then we should expect it to fall to the same international level or lower. And so far, PE, when I last looked, it was 22. I would guess that it will go to 11, which means that the stock market should fall by half, because markets always overshoot in both directions. That's what we have learned, Larry. So when markets move that sharply, there are always bankruptcies. We are still waiting for Bear Stearns. We are perhaps quite far from it. Rudi Dornbusch used to say that financial crises come much later than anybody had expected, and then they move much faster than anybody had anticipated. And so one should predict the timing of a crash, but this is an obvious recipe for a crash. And I was listened to Trump yesterday in his speech, and it was exactly what one could expect. Everything is wonderful. I have done everything perfectly right. And then we read this morning that GDP fell already in the first quarter. And there is much more to come, because the big driver that I would expect is decline in investment, because no sensible businessman can invest in the US. And Trump talks about, is it $7 trillion of investment that has been promised? Well, yes, you can promise to do an investment sometime in the distant future.
Right. Well, let's, on that cheery note, I just want to kind of reinforce what you're saying. I've been speaking to some people that who have been had prominent positions in the U.S. Treasury and other top financial agencies in the government, and asking them exactly this question: is there some Bear Stearns out there? We had 17 major financial institutions collapse during the Great Recession. We had nationalizations of AIG and Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. We had complete bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. We had forced kind of shotgun weddings for other institutions. But these failures put a complete fear into the public's mind, and we had the Great Recession. Now, the people I've been speaking with, former top officials, I asked them, since then, have we developed the ability to look at the hedge funds, the private equity funds, these, that may be leveraged many X's, and do you folks at this point know what's out there apart from the things that you're legally allowed to regulate? No, we don't. And what do you think will happen given everything that's going on? The answer that I received very clearly was something will break. And that's exactly what you're saying, that there's a financial failure, collapse just around the corner potentially that could really put the markets in a tailspin. Anders, it's been a great pleasure. We're going to keep talking through time with you, and let me say that keep at it, keep writing, keep tweeting, keep writing books, because people need to hear your voice.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.